Almost.
It's like a TV program. And we're live. Yes. Live from beautiful downtown Glendale.
I'm sorry.
What da da da.
We have two settings, oven and refrigerator.
Always.
Which one are we on right now?
Are we good? Okay. All right. Welcome, everybody. Hi to this year's, the 2019 annual meeting of the Animation Educators Forum. Now, what this is about more than 10 years ago, trying to remember just how many years ago it was, a couple of animation educators got together, and we suddenly thought, isn't it interesting that, actors get together and talk shop about acting? And animators will get together, and visual effects people will get together, and they'll talk about their crafts. But people who teach animation don't talk to each other. And there's schools all over the place. When I started animation in the 70s, there was I knew, I went to school in New York, and I knew that there was the School of Visual Arts in New York had courses, and there was Cal Arts, and there was a place called Sheridan, and and some at UCLA, and that was kind of it. That was it. That was your choices. And at the time, being a neighborhood kid, the idea of coming to California was like coming to the moon. So it just seemed so far away. So I went to SVA, and but now there's so many schools and there's so many programs and there's so many opportunities for teaching and animation, and there's so many branches to animation now. Where you're talking about stop motion, you're talking about programs for games, you're talking about we have virtual reality now and AI, and augmented reality. There's so many different facets to what we're doing. And there's so many different approaches to what we're doing. Where when I was going to school, a lot of my instructors had grown up in the UPA style of much more emphasis on aesthetics and on non-objective, non-linear filmmaking, because they had learned from the traditional studio people, and they wanted to break with that and wanted to make it different. And then I was like a studio person, so I wanted to break with them and go back to studio stuff. And and we're always having this back and forth. I know at USC, our faculty is divided right down the middle between experimental filmmakers and vocational people. Studio whores like me. And it's interesting because over the years that I've been teaching, I'll see a whole spread of different type of people. I mean, I had a student once who was like, I'm not a jobs monkey, I'm not a wage slave, I'm an artist, I make art. Graduated, boom, right into Disney, Frozen, Zootopia, God bless, great career, she's happy, good for her, and you have people like, Glenn Keane came out of the experimental animation program at Cal Arts, and Tim Burton came out of the traditional program at Cal Arts. So, I had another student at Cal Arts when I was teaching there who was like the classic stoner, he sat in the back of the class like this, drip, like this, and he graduated, bang, he's now a senior concept artist at ILM. It's just like something like he graduated and a light bulb went off and went, oh, this is for real. I got to do it, And so, there's a million and one stories, we could guide and hope they find their way. But the main thing is that we want to make sure that they're equipped with what they need for when they get out there, and then whatever direction they want to go in, they're ready for it. So we found it interesting to just get together and create a series of conversations, a series of dialogue between animation educators, where we could basically, we get to talk shop. We get just to talk to one another and just how we approach different things. And we found that this has been very beneficial for all of us to actually sort of, how do you approach different problems? How do you approach issues? Last year, we talked a lot about the Me Too issues, and the Time's Up issues, because that's been a thing not just in the industry but also in schools too. When I was I was going to an art school in the '70s, and I think it was even my high school. I remember my illustration teacher, saying to me, "You see out there, I can have any girl I want." It's like, whoa. I was like, damn. So that's the attitude in the '70s, But so it's certainly changed, and I think keeping this conversation going, is beneficial to us all. So I just have to give a little bit of a quick report, and then I'll turn it over to the panel. Let me look at my little notes here. The main thing we do is, we do a lot of, we'll have these conversations at various conferences. When you get an opportunity of like a large gathering of animation folks, there's always gatherings of animation educators. So last year, we were at the Breaking the Glass Ceiling conference at it was at Chapman, right? I think it was, at university, and also co-sponsored by Women in Animation, and the Animation Educators Forum is sponsored by ASIFA, so it's ASIFA-Hollywood. And for those of you who don't know ASIFA, when I first heard about ASIFA, I thought it was some kind of terrorist organization, but they're like, no, it's an animation. It's a French acronym. It's like Association Film Animation, whatever it is, and it started in the Cold War. Basically, it was an excuse for Eastern European filmmakers. We would all meet together in France, and they'd have all their duty-free Slivovitz and stuff. And it was delicious. It was a lot of fun. But there was an ASIFA in New York, and there was ASIFA in Hollywood, and they sponsored the Educators Forum, which is much to their delight. Blessings be upon them. They do great stuff. And they'll have events as well. So Breaking the Glass Ceiling was a sponsored event, mainly by Women in Animation, but also by a number of the schools. Also the SIGGRAPH. SIGGRAPH, of course, is the sort of ASIFA's counterpart, specifically about computer graphics. So like it's the Computer Graphics Society, and they have an annual meeting. And last year their meeting was in Vancouver. This year it's in LA again. It's at the LA Convention Center. I believe the end of July, something or in August. I think around there. So we gave we had one of our meetings there, and a panel discussion. We had a panel discussion at CTN, which of course is done in this area. It's like just not too far away here, over by Burbank Airport, and CTN draws a lot of people, and that was a great discussion. We also sponsored some talks at the Society for Animation Studies. This last year was done in Lisbon, Portugal, and a number of other groups. Our normal chair, our chair this year was Harvey Danaroff, and he unfortunately is in New York City right now, which it's not unfortunate for him. He's having a good time, but that's why I was standing. I'm standing in for him. And I didn't introduce myself. I'm sorry. I'm Tom Cito. So I'm a professor at University of Southern California, and a longtime studio animator, author, and filmmaker. I have a new book out, so on Amazon right now. It's doing very well. So anyway, also I want to announce that besides our conferences and meetings, we also do grants. And we have we have funds from ASIFA that we can use in terms of scholarships, and also faculty grants, for faculty research. So this year we're going to announce about 5 student endowments. We're not. I can't say them just yet because they're still contacting the people, the winners. Last year we had. I think we did about. What did we do? About 3, I think. So, I think which was good. Oh, we did 5 last year.
Oh, you said faculty grant. You said student grants.
Oh yeah, student grants.
Faculty grants. We have 5 faculty.
Yeah, we have 5 faculty grants. Yeah, those I can read. Those are going to be official. So, this year, this year's faculty grants go, and and they could either be for like personal projects or they could be for research projects. So, yeah, we awarded money to Cheryl Briggs, University of Central Florida, Winter Springs, Florida, for a video interview project. We awarded to Joshua Mosley, University of Pennsylvania, Philadelphia, towards production of a stop-motion puppet film project he's doing. We awarded to Robert Ribera, Portland State University, Portland, Oregon, for archival research on Disney's World War II propaganda films. And one for Colin Williamson of Pace University, New York City, for research exploring how American animation has intersected with natural history. Again, so that's this year's winners, but we do this every year. Last year, I know one of the ones who we gave a grant to a fellow named Devin Manny of USC, also won the Student Academy Award with his thesis film, which was in part funded by a grant from the Educators Forum. So we try to do a bunch of this kind of charitable stuff, funding conferences as well as these student and faculty grants. And we are a nonprofit, like we're dependent on the kindness of strangers, as they say, and we depend on everybody for support. Now, so far we don't have membership fees or anything like that, because we're sort of building the organization and trying to get as many educators interested. But I invite anybody who wants to get involved with the Educators Forum to contact us. And we don't bite. We're not a cult, like that. We're just a bunch of crazy teachers, and just having a little fun. So, with that, I'd like to introduce today's moderator. Thank you. Today's panel. I know I'm not a morning person. It's like I used to be a night teacher, so like I'm much better after 6 o'clock. It was just like, so anyway, so moderating today's panel is Professor Ellen Besson, who has flown in from Canada and everything just for this. Yeah, I know. We tried to make it gray and lousy so she feels acclimatized, So all that blazing sunlight, it's difficult. But yeah, I remember I was in 2005. I spent a year in Taiwan working on a film. When I came back to Hollywood, the first thing that hit me was how bright the light was. I was like, it's been so long. I was just like, oh damn,
Not today.
It's like a photo flash going on constantly. So, anyway, so Professor Alan Besson from Sheridan College, and Professor Lee Crow, who's you're teaching here in Woodbury right now. So he's doing Woodbury and also CSUN. So, Ellen and Lee.
Thank you so much, Tom.
Okay.
Hello, everybody, and it's still morning now. This year's theme is global perspectives on animation education. It occurs to us that I certainly have had the experience, years ago I had an experience of being on a panel at the Ottawa Festival. Actually, it was the years when they used to have the student festival in between. And it was supposed to be teachers talking about different approaches, and it turned out to be 8 teachers from European schools and me. And I was sort of the in-between person. I have Sheridan background and interest in creative film, but suddenly it was very much a model of hands-off versus the Sheridan very hands-on. And we had a room full of students, some of them from some of the sort of fiercely non-commercial schools, and a few other people, and I've never seen an animation thing where we almost had a fist fight. It was so raucous. I hope that won't happen today. But it was one of the things I always hoped to extend that it was the beginning of a conversation under very odd circumstances. But the reality is, we do, without often realizing it, live within a certain community with certain expectations, and schools reinforce schools, and all the different things that happen. And we don't get a chance to necessarily talk about the differences, what effect that has on the way we educate, on the kinds of films our students produce, etc. So that is what we're going to explore today, a beginning of a much longer conversation, but something to get our minds going, I hope. So I have our 2 panelists here. If you could introduce yourselves, please.
Sure. My name is Rosa Ferre. I'm an assistant professor at East LA College. But I've been teaching at a lot of different places. Like at some point, I was teaching at 5 different, campuses, which was crazy. I think a lot of us do that, right? Like just go from
Yes.
one place to another.
Yeah, my name is Soyeon Kim. Currently, I'm teaching at CSU Long Beach and CalArts as adjunct faculty. And then probably some of other same things. Like I've been teaching 19 years and probably 7, 8 different schools with the different private and the public school and the profit, non-profit. So I know that there are a lot of different administration, different goals. So we can get to talk about what it means and how it affects education today.
And my background is I am from Canada, and I have a background that includes the National Film Board and Sheridan College, so kind of both schools of things. Taught at Sheridan for many years, and now teach primarily online, one-on-one, and also I'm authoring books about animation storytelling. So here we are. So what I'd like to start with is if each of you get a chance to talk a little bit about what your background is and talk about things you may have, if you've come over somewhere else, starting out not perhaps in North America, crossing over here, what effects that had, and just talk for a few minutes, giving a sense of who you are and how that, what kind of approach you take to your animation education.
You go first.
Yeah.
Hi. So hope that my last name Kim doesn't give away too much. I'm from Korea, and then my undergrad study is focusing on painting. So it's a fine art background. Unlike some people who actually got strongly influenced by maybe watching like Saturday cartoon, for me, kind of animation was introduced as a way that I want to combine the timeline in my painting. So moving image was more the primary interest when I started, but then it was early 90s. So back in Korea at that time, there wasn't any animation school. Now there's like several hundreds of them. So my kind of way to get into learning was kind of working in the studio. So as you know, there's a lot of outsource, the production happening, and one company I was starting to kind of learn was 3D and Warner Brothers, the production line. So I got to kind of learn a little bit more about the physical skills in the industry, but then and I knew that there was a little more creative side I wanted to study. So 1999, I came to United States to study, and I went to CalArts in an experimental program. Personally, I mean, Tom was kind of talking about kind of having industry side and then experimental side. Personally, I love both sides, so I'm one of those who like to kind of jump back and forth as needed. And my professional background is I have my own company, kind of just doing a lot of freelance work. Because how I kind of define it is like a short subject. So I do a lot of commercial, PSA, title sequence, that kind of allow me to be a little more creative side because I still kind of get to create the art direction and kind of code the shot, but still working with production companies. One of thing I wanted to bring up to the topic for today is I came as an international student. And then I kind of became immigrant because I've been living here for 20 years and kind of going through the different steps, like working with the visa and kind of getting green card. I chose not to be the citizen. Kind of will talk a little bit more about that. Maybe that will kind of relate to some of how our students are kind of going through different stages as well. So there are I kind of read that there are a huge increase in the international students. So there's 2 different categories. There are international students who kind of came to study, and then there's what some people kind of call integrated domestic international or integrated international. Could be like immigrant who has a different heritage. And then also for me, teaching currently in a private school at CalArts and a public school at CSULB, there's a different demographics, and then we kind of have a different curriculum to really support that. So hopefully all those subjects get to be discussed today, and then love to kind of share the cases and stories, how I kind of just came across the successful cases, and what kind of mistake I made, and how we can really kind of address that in the future education. Yep.
Hello. So my background is very different. I'm much older than you. I came to computer graphics from the side of computer science. When I started, there were no computer graphics schools. What you were saying earlier, right? There were no computer graphics schools at all. And a lot of what we did, was basically you have to type in commands to do things for you. There weren't interfaces. So a lot of us the starting computer graphics way back then came from that area, engineering, computer science, things like that. But obviously you have to have that artistic ability. That's something that I was never trained in, and I kind of had to train myself throughout my professional career. I discovered computer animation because I was hiring a company that did that. They needed technicians. And I loved it. It was loved at first sight. I decided I want to do more of it. I was in that company for about 3 years in Spain. They sent me to SIGGRAPH a couple of times, every year for the conference. And that's when I started meeting people from everywhere, from all over the world. And I realized that, my country of origin, Spain, was a little too small for me. So I decided to move to the States. And I went through the same issues, visas and all of that not so fun stuff. I managed to end up in company Metrolight Studios, which obviously does no longer exist. Like many visual effects companies that they go, they're not profitable. They go belly up very quickly. But it was fantastic. I loved it. We were working on films. We actually, I think at Metrolight, the company got the first Oscar for visual effects, for digital visual effects ever, to the first Total Recall, not the second one. Just talking about preferences, right? Just in case somebody was born after 2000. And I always felt like, for me, what really interests me about computer graphics was that problem-solving part of it, and learning the whole art aspect of it came almost like a secondary thing, a thing that I had to do, but it was really nice to discover that I could do that. I would never consider myself a fine art person. I'm not. It's hard for me to draw, it's hard for me, but at the same time, if you don't have both parts of the brain, I don't think it's not going to be an easy thing for you to be in the business, right? I think you have to be a little bit of both, a technical person and an artistic person. In terms of how, I realized that when I came here to the States, like at Metrolight, for example, I want to say 50% of the people there were foreigners. There were 2 Canadians, 2 Italians, 2 French, 2 French people. So there was so much demand, much more demand than offer. So a lot of companies, and this wasn't a weird thing, basically a lot of the companies that did visual effects back then had half of their staff were from, international, from all over the place. And I think to this day, it still works like that. If you go to the movies and you take a look at the credits, you're going to see that half of the credits, they're long credits, are from companies that are in Poland, or not even companies in Poland, but people that are from Russia, from Poland, from Europe, from Asia, right, all over the place. And so to me, that felt very natural. I always thought that in the industry, everybody was from everywhere, and I don't know if it's the same in the animation industry. Do you feel like in the animation industry it's the same? Like there's a huge amount of international makeup in terms of the same as well, right? So when I started thinking about, well, do I teach differently because I am from a country, that I didn't really. It was hard for me to figure out if I was doing anything differently, because I don't know. And then I started looking at expectations, right? Like when I started teaching, I had conceptions about what a student would look like based on, my school days, and there, I had to overcome those preconceptions, and I had to adapt to that. In terms of whether there are different styles of teaching, I don't really think so. I think that's more like, yeah, there are different styles of teaching because I'm a different person than you are. Because we teach the same techniques, we teach the same tools. There is definitely a different of visual styles that come from our personal cultural background, right? If you look at films from or animations from France, or animations from Spain, or animations from different parts of the world, they do have a different flavor. They do have that aesthetic quality that sometimes you can even pinpoint that that's a French animation, but I don't know. I think
I guess we're going to explore this today.
Yes.
We can see the assessment of the step. Funny you were saying about meeting the two sides. My deep background is my mother was an artist and my father was an engineer. And my brain was always a half and half. And I found it very hard to find an area that seemed to satisfy this weird mix I had in animation. In those days, you didn't want to be an animator. People didn't even know what the word animation meant. So you'd fall into it by accident, and I fell into Sheridan College by accident. But my training, I think my background, again, in terms of sometimes there's deep elements we don't even think about being part of a national profile. In my case, living in Canada, and Canada is almost all a border population. It's so strung along the border between our country and the States that inevitably some things sort of wash over us from the States. So as a kid, I grew up on the one hand watching, hours and hours of old Warner Brothers cartoons, including all the weirdest ones they ever made. Everything that came pouring over. That was our Saturday morning, treat. And so a huge, with every Disney film and everything. So all this influence coming in from one side and lapping it up, absolutely loving it. But on the other hand, we are also being continuously shown films for the National Film Board of Canada. Those ones, I can't remember where we saw them. It was just kind of there. And ask anybody who grew up in Canada before a certain era, and they all say the same thing. Just those films were being shown to us. We were absorbing, and these were films that were coming. They were the deliberately anti-Disney. They were the ones where they were trying to find more immediate ways to make film, and they were trying to experiment with different styles and everything. And of course, the heart of the National Film Board was that it started out as a propaganda arm of the Canadian government, started during the war, and then became the government's arm for creating educational work. And so when they set up the animation department, they bring in a guy, Norman McLaren, we've all heard of, who was an experimental filmmaker. And they said, well, how am I going to do propaganda films with white tools? He says, well, then you'll just, if you're supposed to say do something about the using the mailing early for Christmas was one of the first things he did. Just do it experimentally. And by doing that one thing, it became part of the foundation of the animation department in particular. It gave license to be not only the practical side, but also the experimental side. Right from the start, it was built in. And that became gradually not only that they had the necessity of doing governmental educational films, but also doing personal films and letting the styles cross over back and forth in this very free-form way. So on the one hand, you had a tremendous amount of room for creativity, but at the same time, because it was all government funded, because it had to sort of meet an expectation of being available to all Canadians, you couldn't come in with the idea that you were going to take a loop of animation and run it for 2 or 3 hours and let's see what kind of experience. In other words, the full-scale, experimental, all boundaries off was not something you could ever get through the bureaucratic process there. You had to take the edges off of it. You had to bring it towards, you had to sort of load it up with meaning. And even if you're really trying, McLaren was trying all kinds of things that had never been done for years, but it also had to be accessible somehow. It had to have rhythm and element that make it a watchable film. And I realized that somehow between the American work, which was definitely the very watchable, and the slight containment of the Canadian version as well as the experimental, it creates a sort of a middle ground that, without ever thinking about it, became the foundation of how I think about animation and how I teach it as well. So that is my little background there. So what I'd like to open up in some of these questions is, we can ask ourselves, are there different styles? I don't know if either you can identify something that you might bring to your filmmaking. Like, for instance, you talk about there being different kinds of students that you would hear, or your expectation. Can you remember what the expectation was that you had to move beyond?
Yeah, but in terms of expectations, I remember, because at the beginning when I started teaching, I actually started teaching people within my company. A lot of people were coming that, for example, didn't know how to write renderman shaders. And we were using renderman, never knew how to code those things. So we wanted to facilitate the artists that didn't have that background to be able to learn that. So I started teaching, people that were in the industry professionals. They were already where they knew what they wanted. They knew that this was the field they wanted to be in. And that's very different than teaching, somebody that's just coming out of high school. That the expectations are different, their goals are different. But so that for me, when I switched from that type of training to college training, that was my first kind of like big wall. I hit a big wall there because I thought everybody was really good at math. And I thought that, and yes, that was a big, big problem. And again, granted, you don't need that's the thing. That's where I'm coming from. It's like you don't need a lot of math, but you need to understand what an aspect ratio is, for example, and how do you get there, right? And if you go from 30 frames per second to 24 frames per second, how many frames do you need? So that to me is just basic common sense, not. But I would, immediately when I would ask students, give me the aspect ratio of this image, and they'll raise their hands like, we're artists, we're not math. Like, are you kidding me? So that was my first expectation I had to adapt very quickly to. Weak math skills and sometimes even problem-solving skills. Then another thing was in Spain, where I'm coming from, university is right now currently is a whole year. It's definitely under $3,000 a year for a whole year. So we have a student population that's younger because as soon as you finish high school, you're just going to university. And you are a full-time student because you can afford to be a full-time student. And that to me, I assumed that everybody was like that, right? It's like, why? So having to adapt to students that were a lot older, that had a lot of problems in terms of, they were supporting a family or they had a job or they were part-time students instead of full-time students. And I remember me, just getting mad at some of them going, why aren't you putting more time into this? This is your passion. I'm too tired. I have 2 kids to feed. And so this was another expectation that I had to adapt very, very quickly. Grading systems, that's a whole other thing. But I had a few more notes in here. But those I think that you adapt to. You learn how to, obviously, if you have more adult students, you figure out how to teach them. If you have part-time students, and you figure out how to deal with that. Another thing that I'm still dealing with is students that enroll in school kind of because they have to pick something and that passion is not there. We can only meet them so far, right? They have to meet us half the way. And I've had students that start in the animation program and 2 semesters later they go into the culinary program. And it's like, well, if you're in this industry, you kind of need to understand that this is an industry that is very demanding. You have to love it. If you don't love it, it's going to be very hard for you to do this type of work. We were talking earlier about the long hours that we have to put and working weekends and that's the only thing that I really don't have a happy in terms of expectations. I would expect somebody that enrolls in animation school to want to be in animation school. Do you find the same issues? Or?
For me, kind of a little different, and I may kind of a little opposite. I just, from my perspective, I want to kind of talk about a few things. Like, I mean, we kind of have a previous conversation about Rosa kind of being in a visual effects. So a lot of your class are kind of more kind of focused on the skill. Just kind of give you a little kind of the background. So most of my classes are kind of 2 different categories. The one, I'm very interested in the community engagement. So one of the students example that I'm going to actually show you is at CalArts, we partner with the UN, UN Women. So we are kind of looking at the women's issue globally, and the students really kind of have to kind of go into like how we can really kind of discuss that issue and kind of incorporate that in the filmmaking. Another classes I teach a lot is a senior film, which like if I kind of teach animation one, for example, we kind of talk about, okay, let's kind of learn about the walk cycle. Then we kind of tend to talk more about what is really need to be there, what's the principle. So I may not really kind of talk much about like how individual students may need to execute differently because we are still learning about the principle. A lot of other classes are senior film. So I always say making film is easy. Making film well is difficult. Making film to be very you and how this film can really feature your vision is really, really hard. So I think it depends on what kind of classes that we are approaching, like how we are kind of bringing individual perspective, global perspective. I think that really kind of has a different importance in it. Mainly because I kind of teach a lot of senior film classes. For me, actually, they are putting easily 100 hours a week. I guess I'm lucky. I don't have any problem like them not working. Sometimes they're working too much. I kind of have to like make sure that they have physical, mental health balances. So I'm very grateful for that. Sometimes the students, depends on how they kind of ends up coming into the animation industry. Some students have stronger influence and then watching a lot of feature films and a lot of Saturday cartoon. So they kind of want to have their version of another superhero, another version of maybe folktale. They're all, of course, all wonderful. For me, as a student, what I really kind of want them to focus on is like, who are you as an artist? I always start with having them write their artist statement. So it's really not about focusing on skill, which is really important because we all know that execution is a really important part of how we kind of present the content. But as a teacher, I rather kind of see the students really kind of using that senior film process as a way of what kind of artist they want to be. As long as they're kind of willing to kind of continue to polish their skills. I think that's where a lot of their heritage, different background, what their upbringing was, what they're introduced to, really kind of get to be part of who they are. So I would say that really like intro level, intermediate level, senior level, really kind of have a different way of adaptation to the subject that get to be a part of the curriculum.
I mean, part of what happens, I think, in terms of, now, on the one hand, we don't have someone here to represent this, but one thing I learned at that panel I was in many years ago was that almost everybody coming in from the European schools, and I don't know if this is true today, was very much of the school, you kind of put the students in a room and you shut the door, and you kind of wait and see what happens. They were producing wonderful films, and it was, but you know, the North American style has always been, you know, since the inception of education with schools like Sheridan and CalArts, it was a very structured approach. And you know, I think when you get used to a structured approach, you're almost afraid to say, what would happen if I didn't tell them everything? And I wonder if have you ever played yourselves with different approaches in terms of more or less structure, or do you accept, say, the approach that has tended to be fairly standard here?
Like to maybe kind of follow up what I was kind of talking about. In a senior film, I think at the week one I kind of said that when I kind of know that I'm failing as a teacher is when I have 20 students born differently, and often case different town, different culture, different parents, different upbringing, and somehow there are a lot of similar films.
Right.
So and we are not really kind of finding our own voice.
The problem of generic thinking,
Yes.
actually, yeah.
So the class running will be rather not about how they should make film per se. It's really more about how can we find a way to really address that. So definitely senior film has a lot more discussions and then exploration, I kind of call it, than like a structural how to make a film method.
And ask for sort of, that's certainly something I've also always ran into the same issue that the first film that people would want to make the ideas, they were drawing from somehow some magical part of animation was the same very narrow, but the ideas were not well thought out. And they were very similar all the time, and it was hard to. That was one of the hardest issues. Do you run into that with your work as well?
Yeah, I mean, for me, coming from visual effects, because there isn't that component of storytelling, is not as elementary or as important as with animation. I don't run into this problem as much. our side of things is a bit more towards, just a bit more technical. You still need to make sure that everything looks okay, but our goal is not storytelling. Our goal is more make sure everything looks realistic,
Yeah.
right? However, you're asking about teaching approaches, and I do that. I do that quite a bit, and I didn't realize I was doing that until students would complain, and then on purpose, I decided that I think they need that. I think students need to be left alone. I don't do that at in the early classes. I do it towards the end, portfolio classes, project classes, where at that point they have to be able to be a bit more independent, self-contained, and they go there kicking and screaming. They don't like that. They don't like being left alone and left to explore things on their own, which I find interesting though, because I didn't think it was. For me, it wasn't. You said it feels more like a European approach. I didn't think I was doing that because of my upbringing, but because in Europe also we have, I believe, less tradition of liberal arts.
Okay.
In the sense where you find liberal arts here, I think liberal arts are much stronger in the States than it is in Europe. But yeah, it's try to get them to do critical thinking. Try to get them to explore, analyze. That's always students don't like to do that on their own.
Can any of you think of, have you found particular either tricks or exercises? Because this becomes the biggest problem of all. And the more the world is held together by things like YouTube and other elements, the more this will actually become worse, basically. Everybody's watching the same cat videos and the same whatever. All the way around the world. The beauty of this huge technology doing the silliest amateur stuff sometimes. But in a certain kind of way, we're crossing over the old barriers to going to a very generic model. I'm wondering if you have anything to share around that or breaking through regardless of background to help them get back to their own originality.
Yeah, I have one, especially for the senior film, week 1 and 2. I have, I call it, I think, just a concept exploration sheet. So there are 30 different ways that, there's literally billions of different ways to kind of come up with their motivation and a concept for their film. But I kind of talk with a lot of filmmakers coming from different background, different culture, different purpose of making film. Sometimes there are social justice issues, sometimes a pure visual experiment. Some people love to kind of explore the techniques. So when they really kind of have a different way to start thinking about making this media art, how would they go about it and what would be the end result? So I kind of found that, like, when I first asked about everybody's film idea, like I just kind of suggest that whether they realize it or not, there's a lot of influence by what we actually see on TV or kind of feature film. And as I said, that's absolutely wonderful. But I want people to feel like they're kind of choosing that direction after they kind of explore and kind of question who they are as a filmmaker. So I try to kind of include like all 6 continents, a word, and a visual artist point of view. Some people who love to do installation based of the film art. So every student is required to kind of answer like, if you actually have a concept based on your childhood happy memory, what kind of film would you imagine? Number 13 will be, what is the movement that you're fascinated by? If you're making film based on the movement, what that could be. Did you talk with your grandfather? What kind of, especially in this generation, I think either our parents or our grandparents, they kind of went through some kind of war. So like, how was direct to it? Like a few of my students, especially in the CSULB, we have a lot of students from Laos and Vietnam, and some actually kind of came from the refugees. Some actually was born in America, so their heritage is from the Vietnam, but they don't really kind of get to know much about it. And kind of allowing them to have a chance to interview their grandparents. It's not about what we see in a documentary of the Vietnam War. They have a different the history. They have a different lifestyle. So a lot of students really kind of find the filmmaking as a way that they really kind of reconnect with their roots. And like I just kind of took it granted about like living in the United States, and it just kind of give me a new chance to see who I am. And I think that's one of the things I really kind of emphasize. And they don't have to kind of use that for their film, but even kind of going through that process always seems to kind of bring them like a different definition of who they are, who wants to be as a filmmaker. I think that's an important part of it.
Rose, I'm wondering also for you, given that, let's even like take a subject like lighting or something, you know, of the technical realm. Do students end up exploring? There are different styles of lighting. If you think like back through historical, different painting series of different countries develop different ways of using. And does that come into the element of how you teach at all? Do we try and widen there?
Well, yes and no. I mean, you do try to expose them to a lot of different styles, but I don't pick necessarily particular styles that are culturally specific. But yeah, I mean, we go back to, you know, I think for me it's more like go back to the classics, go back to, you know, paintings, looking at paintings of the Renaissance, of, you know, we even look at then at what's the type of movie? Sorry, I'm just blanking out.
Asian or?
Humphrey Bogart.
Film noir.
Film noir.
Yes,
Thank you.
yeah.
So and sometimes I do bring films. For example, just the other day we were looking at Amour, which is this French film. I had them do storyboards using the script. And they all did this script that was very, very much like, it felt like it was a visual effects movie. It felt like, you know, there's somebody that's been killed in a room, and there's police coming, and there's sirens. And then I show them the film, right? I show them the little intro, which is very peaceful and very calm. There's like almost like 3 minutes of a single camera shot. And that was a bit of a shock to them. So in a way, yes, I try to expose them to different particular, you know, styles, and but I don't do it with that you know, state of mind of explore your own culture, explore your own. For me, it's more like you as an individual, you need to be exposed to a range of information, to a range of styles, to a range of skills, and hopefully you'll find your own. But I don't push that as directly as, again, because I don't go through a lot of storytelling process in my classes because I don't have to.
Right. Now, of course, we should bring up that idea. We're using the storytelling, but of course, we can have strong feelings. So, and you were talking a little bit about how you I dropped that word into the conversation, and boom, I got it. But that was interesting. I think it's important for in animation that we that's another groove we get into.
Yeah,
and forget.
Yeah, a lot of teachers kind of like refer filmmaking as like a storytelling process, but then it just like, without really realizing, we kind of limit ourselves so much into it's about the narrative film. So personally, because I do character-driven narrative as much as I love visual experimental film, so I try not to kind of use the term that film, like let's talk about the story. So I always kind of try to kind of say like concept. Because some students actually came to me more than several times, like, well, Soyeon, I really want to kind of make the visual focus the film, and am I allowed to do it? Who said not? Oh, because everybody said, what's your story? What's your story? So some school has a very strong narrative focus curriculum. I mean, like each school has their focus and their expertise in their curriculum development. One time, I remember kind of having an interview, was like a full-time job interview, and then I said, oh, I love like a non-narrative film as much as a non-narrative. Suddenly the whole committee is like, what do you mean there's such thing as like a non-narrative film? And give us example. Like suddenly I said, so I didn't get the job.
How do you dare, right?
So I pushed the wrong button there for sure. But then I guess some of those mistakes like that,
Yeah.
make sure that we don't mean it, and like a lot of teachers may be open-minded,
Yeah.
but terminology we are kind of we happen to drop. It
Yeah.
really kind of give unconscious impression about like, oh, that's what teachers expecting it. So just to try to kind of be a little more careful. And a lot of students, I mean, are definitely more character story driven, but I kind of feel like sometimes the students who are more focusing on experimental, they feel like left out, and
Yeah.
then when they're kind of going through the curriculum, so and I really want to focus on this one. I don't know what classes to take, and not many subjects that get to be discussed. I mean, that's part of the reason that CalArts kind of split that department so that they ends up having experimental program for that reason. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think we actually, you just made me think about. I was looking at reels for instructors. I was in a hiring committee the other day, and we were looking at demo reels from instructors, from their students, and it was funny how after as we're looking at all of that, and we started pointing out, it's like, okay, I know this was done at USC because it has that flavor. I know this was done at CalArts because and sure enough, we look at the people's resume, and yeah, that person came from CalArts.
There was
That
a
person-
Sheridan look that also had that.
Yeah,
same-
yeah.
very much
So
a- yeah.
it's interesting how we do that.
We
There
create
there
those are
is
the cultures we create that we then invest in.
yeah,
Yes. Yeah.
and
exactly,
and
trying to
yeah,
explode.
and it comes from our personal background. Obviously, my upbringing had a lot to do with who I am today, right? And I, project that whether I'm aware of it or not. But yeah, and it's hard, even though we probably try not to. It's hard not to imprint those styles and those things, and it shows. It definitely shows in everybody's work.
I wonder if part of what I mean, is it also our job as educators to expose our students to more variety, not only animation history, or film history, obviously, but then also other areas of art and science and things that give them. In other words, part of what the problem I see is they're all feeding off the same pool of information, and they come in not they're so deep into that it doesn't occur to them that they are in this little pool. And I used to do an exercise. I began to realize that all my students, whatever I said or did, if they had an old woman in their story, have I told this story? I won't. No, I don't think I have. I told that if they had an old woman in their story, no matter what the kind of story it was, whether it was funny or supposed to be tragic, whether it was set, in centuries ago or supposed to be in the future or whatever, it was always the same old lady that they were drawing. So one day I had them all, I was seeing it over this after a couple of years of this, and it was becoming very consistent. I had them all get out their sketchbooks, and without looking at each other's work, I said, draw an old lady. I'm giving you 1 minute. Give me a sketch of an old lady. And then I said, don't look at each other's work, just look at your own. I go and I go to the front of the class and I would say, okay, how many of them have a bun? And all the hands would go. How many of them have these little tiny glasses? All the hands go. How many have a dress down to here? All the hands go up. On and on and on, until finally, of course, they were drawing, it's either Whistler's mother or it's the old lady from the Warner Brothers cartoons. But regardless, this was the only old lady they were using. I said, who is she? Is that your grandmother? Is that any old woman you've ever seen? How and why? And they would be so shocked. It was great because they'd all laugh, of course, when they realized they had all like almost. You might find 2 people out of a class of 30 who might have done anything even slightly. But to me, it was the epitome of that.
Yeah.
The big world becoming smaller, actually, because we're drawing from the same pool. And then from there began the conversation of where else are you in a rut. I mean, we're talking about different ways to try and get over those problems and get ourselves and also be aware of our own.
Yeah.
So do you build into curriculum, for example, exposure or pushing people to go and look at more things, to consider a wider range of vocabulary?
Yeah, I'm very conscious about always choosing example that doesn't come from one country.
Okay.
And then not even just a Europe and then North America, always kind of include at least 3 or 4 different area. Asian, I mean, when people kind of say Europe, we have some European. So the Eastern European like a film history and is very different than the other. And then when we kind of talk about European, sometimes I don't really know what it means. I mean, how many countries in Europe, right?
Spain versus Germany,
Yeah, so
They're just
like
a little different from each other.
I heard more than several times that you're not like Korean. What do you mean like being Korean?
Yeah.
So I don't think anybody kind of mean to like generalize. It's just a certain time, so it's come out as expressions. So kind of try to be really kind of careful whether they are from France, whether they are from the Germany. Like it doesn't necessarily mean that they are trying to make German looking film, and I don't really know exactly what that means. So so like when I kind of show the certain art directions, and then I usually like to kind of go with like how like Disney, classic Disney kind of achieve, and then but then how different part of European films, and then the different area, different techniques. So what does that mean, and then how it get to actually influence each other. So at least kind of having more than several different examples that really feature the diverse direction always kind of seem to give a better idea about how they can consider that for their film as well.
Yeah, and the same for me. I try to, for example, in that storyboarding class, I do a similar exercise of what you're doing, only I do it with samurais, not with old ladies. and it's funny because everybody comes up with the same samurai, and then once in a while, I have students that would come up with this, you know, a women samurai. And I know that's not probably very realistic, but that's the thing that I'm trying to get out of them. Why couldn't you have a, and the same thing, have them look at films as diverse of something like Amour or something like films from Kurosawa. When I talk about the binary rule, you know, we do it with Kurosawa films. And then we go to Hitchcock films, and then we, and it is interesting to me how, what you guys said, there's just very little culture on, you know, film culture. They don't, you know, you mentioned Hitchcock and have them don't know what who you know, his films are and who he was.
Or you say the Beatles that people
Or the Beatles, yeah. But I don't take, I don't feel insulted, but it's like you need to bring these examples because clearly they are not seeing that wide range of styles, and that, you know, they cannot be impoverished by that. They have to feed onto those, you know, different styles. I don't even want to call them cultures, but.
Now I wonder if part of that also is, you know, Canada has been a country that struggled with the idea of culture, and because we, you know, we came up as a country just around the time when having a mountain range or river between countries wasn't enough to create the kind of isolation that produces a separate culture. And we're right beside the United States of America, which is this gangbusters that you know, in this interesting, but you know, we're in this like big space, little population, you know, hovering there being washed over. So there was, you know, we've gone through, you know, is it more than just, you know, maple syrup? You know, we have our cliches. But say, if you take an example like film noir, which of course goes back to a German sensibility of, you know, 1920s and 30s and the horrors of the war, you know, there's all sorts of reasons why film noir came out of that culture in that moment and the traditions that they had that would not come out of any other place. And it's become this, you know, thing now go from that tiny to a widely held thing without people necessarily knowing the real why. And I wonder, do you ever get, you know, it's not only do we want to go wide, but do we want to go deep? Do we want to find ways to, it's occurring to me we're kind of creating world culture right now that we're, you know, and that right now it is cat videos and we need to, we have a job ahead of us.
I don't know so much if the intention is I want to go deeper, but eventually you will have to go deeper, right? You have to, so it naturally, you get there perhaps in a more natural way, but yes, I think my take on it would be yes.
For me, I think a lot of students, I mean, compared to 2008, 2013, there's a 40% of increase in international students. And I do really solely believe, I don't have like the data of the 2018 or 19.
Okay,
I think it also kind of double up. And then how we actually implement some of multicultural aspect in the curriculum is kind of one way that we can kind of do as educator. But really, like how students actually kind of like work as a peer system, I feel like that really kind of make a very natural way to really introduce their culture and kind of integrate it among themselves.
Yeah.
So I think especially like a lot of my students in front of me, they really kind of seem to so naturally embrace the diversity.
Yeah.
And I think maybe we are the generations that somehow work with a lot of stereotype and bias and some of those kind of concepts. And then we are kind of trying to kind of break away from that as a teacher, of course, but then really kind of allowing our students to really kind of bring their opinion and then really kind of have them form their own peer system. I think that's really kind of good way that, like as artists, that will be a part of their self-expression as well as how we get to actually learn about how new generation is really changing how we are kind of thinking about the idea of a global aspect of it.
Yeah.
Like personally, I really kind of love to kind of see that how that will make everything to be more kind of positive.
It's an interesting point you bring, because also the point of, on the one hand, certainly like the Sheridan model, you're always up against industry standards. That, you know, that is so much what the push is to meet this thing that already exists that you're trying to fit yourself into, as opposed to using animation as a way to come up with something personal. And in reality, great culture usually comes somewhere in between those things. So I mean, I don't know if that's something we can address in terms of how do we find balance between those different needs. Is the industry standard part of what holds back these different perspectives coming forward, or is it a good thing?
I mean, I don't really see why they need to be two antagonizing positions. I mean, you need both.
I think it was Sheridan that made me feel that way. Very specifically.
Bad Sheridan. Yeah, I mean, again, techniques and concepts, and those are universal, right? You learned when you teach animation, you teach the principles of animation, and there's obviously a place for that. And again, at the beginning, when the student starts, you might focus a lot more on those more academic skills. And as they move forward in their curriculum, that's when you kind of need to let go, and that's when hopefully they've learned enough, and that's when they can, they can bring their own idiosyncrasies to the table. I think if you do it in that order, to me, it works pretty well. Start with the academic, start with the more structure, and then let them fly a bit on their own. And hopefully good ideas will come up that way. I also have a question. What is the percentage of international students that you have in class, that you guys have in class?
I don't know actual data, so I don't want to kind of make a mistake of kind of like mentioning it. But like at CalArts, there are a lot of international students who actually come from the different country, and then we have Lee from the CSU Northridge and Kim from CSULB. So please, like, if you have any additional comments, like, please add.
So we're going to go to Q&A quite soon, so we can start throwing
but
it in
then
there.
I think generally in the CSU, we used to kind of call the commute students groups. That means most of people kind of are in that like adjacent neighborhood. I mean, they might be kind of living in LA and commuting to Long Beach, but part of kind of tuition difference and things like that, I think most of people are kind of California residents. But compared to like 10 years ago, just the first time I kind of started teaching at the CSU Long Beach, I mean, there was like a huge difference. I mean, we always had that good population of Hmong students who came with the family as an immigrant together. But definitely there's a huge, I think every institution worldwide is kind of experiencing a huge international students from a lot of different parts of the country. So out of 20 students, for international with the different citizenship, I would probably say like 5 students this day. But also when we kind of talk about integrated international, that means that they might be citizen, but they have a different heritage.
Right.
So that's totally different thing. So like I came here 20 years ago, I still kind of maintain my citizenship. I married to Americans, I could have changed it, but I felt like I was born in the country. I finished my entire education. So I felt like that's kind of part of who I was, because I changed my opinion recently now. Because I think that's another thing that people kind of talk about, like, oh, you're not Korean, you know. So I think that might be kind of interesting to kind of ask, because I'm kind of generally kind of curious to other teachers that, like when you actually kind of have a different heritage, different culture, students that, like we often kind of say, like I have students from Syria, and then like how much we really know about the Syria? We have students from like a different part of the refugee or like Iran, and like I kind of heard more than a few times that I know what you kind of went through, but do we? You know, something like that could really easily offend the students. And then I guess me kind of mentioning about me not being Korean enough is like sometimes I used to say, because I still have a Korean citizenship, so when I kind of talk with Korean students, like, I spent my more than 30 years there, so I feel like I know the culture, until I kind of have a conversation with my sister, because I was doing research project about North Korea and South Korea, and she kind of pointed out, it's not about what kind of passport that you have. You live in America for 20 years, you don't really seem to understand what daily exposure really means. That really kind of changed a lot of how I kind of really talk with my students. And even like when I talk with the Korean students, I will never say like, oh, I was born there, but then I kind of live away for 20 years. So like, because the students assume that I know what it's like to be nation and what it's like to be in Korean.
And if you're not there, I mean, culture is often all the tiny little things that gradually add up to some changing heart that and if you're not really in it, you're not in it.
So also I kind of heard other faculty members say that, oh yeah, my friend is from Hungary, my friend is from German, I know what it's like. It's like a Dewey. So I think we means well, like we want to emphasize, we want to understand. So we are pulling as a teacher, trying to kind of pull the information to really like understand and help our students out. But some of a social cue that we are often like not really like think about. I think students actually get influenced a lot by how we kind of speak.
And I also think American students are a bit of in a disadvantage, perhaps, because you know, American culture is so visible to the world, right? It's so exportable, but it doesn't happen all the way around. And perhaps what gets exported might not necessarily be representative of what it means to be American, right? But it's a whole different subject. But I think the other way around doesn't. Right, most European students have been exposed to the American culture in a way in which it doesn't happen the other way around. And that I feel that a lot in the classroom.
And can you give an example of how that expresses itself, or what issues it creates?
It just simply, you know, a lack of knowledge of filmography, for example, right? A lack of, you know, when you talk about certain directors or certain animators or certain, they don't really know much about it. And then you expose them to certain films, to certain directors, and they love it, right? And they start learning a little bit about it. And it's nice when you're in a classroom where there is a small percentage of international students, because that happens in a more natural way. That exposure happens in a much more natural way. For example, I see that like when I teach at Easterly College, there aren't that many international students there. I have maybe one or two in every semester. But when I teach at Nomen, I want to say in there, 30% of the population, student population, is from other countries. And you feel that, you know, the fact that, you know, they get exposed to different ways of thinking, or different people, or different cultures, or the fact that they understand how, you know, some of the students have a hard time speaking English, right? And maybe there's those you know, issues with dialogue, with communication, and little by little, it's easy for them to put themselves into the other person's shoes. And that exposure opens their minds quite a bit.
Do you have anything that you've tried? You were talking about some things where you wanted to share some things that didn't work out. Do you have ideas where you've tried something in order to bring around the kind of dialogue you hoped for, where it was problematic, or?
I think maybe kind of similar to what I thought that I understand their culture, like especially when I actually kind of work with the UN Women one, because there's a lot of like a woman upbringing and oppression kind of growing up with that. We research together with the students, and a lot of students kind of find out that, especially based on statistics and like what it kind of show. Like for one example, child marriage, we all assume that, oh, that happens in Africa, that happens somewhere. But then also there's like a good percentage happening in America. That's literally entirely kind of changed that. So I don't know necessarily like a certain method that didn't really work, but it's like how I kind of thought that I knew, especially in my own country, like I thought that I knew well enough. I knew what Asian upbringing was like. But then we also kind of have a lot of different social class and different demographics. And when you actually kind of like talk with an international person, you never really kind of want to assume anything. Like, and then when I was at CalArts, because the CalArts tuition is quite high. 20 years ago was a high too. So everybody kind of say, oh, you're like a rich girl. And then like I had like 5 jobs, and my wage was like $1 an hour that time. It's like when I came to CalArts and I started working as a TA, $4, my American dream. So it's like how much I kind of had to work hard, 5 years, not going any party the whole time in the college, and then saving up 5 years, could afford half of first tuition.
Wow. Okay.
So like when so I kind of find a lot of students are kind of like that too. I do have undocumented immigrant students at CalArts. So sometimes it's like a bias again. So it's something that we as a human being don't really want to kind of apply, but sometimes as a teacher, with good meaning. It's like, oh, I understand. Exactly. I understand where I came from. But then like, I think sometimes students kind of feel like they cannot really kind of say, well, I'm not from where you think I'm from, for so many different reasons. So I think it's just a subject of multiple global perspectives. We'll try to embrace, we'll try to understand, but never assume that we know about anything, especially when it comes to individual students.
And of course, and what you've pointed out, of course, is this global perspective is only one way to look at the many variations in what we deal with students. Because it is things like a social background, it is an expectation. We have so many expectations of things we don't about things we don't really know. And the constant thing as a teacher is trying to figure that out. And then how do you fit it into the structure of what we want to teach in animation? Oh, I was going to just throw over to Lee, but she's disappeared. Okay. I was thinking. I think it's time we should throw it open to any questions from the audience. Anything anyone wants to ask about or bring up or throw a point? Yeah.
You mentioned something really interesting in here, and is one of the problems there is in teaching. That is like, how do you balance the teaching the students the industry standards, so when they finish their 3, 5, 4 years, they can get into the animation film industry, versus promoting having a personal voice as an artist. So there's always like 2 different kind of like opposite problems there.
Yes.
How do you balance that in the teaching? How do you balance the giving the students the basic to be able to get a job in the industry, versus teaching the students to generate their own personal films and develop as an individual artist?
As I said earlier, I don't really think those 2 things are fighting against each other. You have to go through the process of learning the skills, and the skills are pretty generic, pretty global. Everybody more or less has to learn the same type of skills, the same pipelines, the same methods. When you go into those portfolio classes, onto those later classes, that's when hopefully the student will come up with their own ideas, their own thoughts. That's the point where you might need to nudge them a little bit into trying not to do something that doesn't doesn't, it's not them, right? And you will see right away when that happens, because the concept or the project doesn't come together all that well. They're trying to do something that they're not super comfortable with or familiar with, or and sometimes you nudge them. Like I remember a particular student that he wanted to be, he wanted to do this very Latin type of subjects. He wanted to and he was Mexican. He was falling a little bit into stereotypical visual concepts that weren't all that, to me, that good or interesting. And we had to kind of nudge them in the right direction. It's like, yeah, I mean, you can show your culture. You can show that through the use of colors, through the use of shapes, through the use of your characters, your designs. And if that's what you want to do, obviously do that. We're not ever going to tell you you have to touch on these concepts or this subject or this. And that's, at that point, that's when they can, I think, express who they are. So come up with your own ideas. They have to be your own ideas. They shouldn't be, don't copy what you see. And if your ideas are not coming together, we'll help you, try to go a bit more in depth into what are you trying to do here? What is the goal? Why this subject? Why does this look like that? We're going to try to help you think about that process from a more analytical point of view. But, but all of the techniques and the tools that you've learned, those you need to bring to the table. So that's why I'm saying I don't see how one thing butts against each other.
I think a lot of it actually ends up being the attitude of the school and the teachers. The example, Sheridan, especially when I was a student there, was pressing not only a technique but a content with equal value, and they were so mixed up together. As a young person, I couldn't, it was very hard to pull them apart. And many people talked in those days of coming out of Sheridan and being afraid to draw for 2 years because they couldn't, fit themselves into that. It was sold at a certain level of being the only way to do things. By the time I was teaching, there came a point where I often had students who would be coming to us for our summer school program, which was still grounded in Hollywood value. It was actually Americans who came up, someone from Hollywood came up to Canada and sold Sheridan College on this idea of doing this program. So it was very much a kind of a combination of cultures from the get-go. But they would, in the winter, they would go to another one of the major schools in Canada, is Concordia, and we have one in Vancouver, Emily Carr, that are very much anti-Disney. So they would go to those ones, they go a summer thing at one of the more open creative schools, and then come to Sheridan to get their technique, telling you they felt they had to have both somehow, but they needed a distinguishing point. What I found in teaching, most of my work was with third-year students who were in their final year, they would had 2 years of basically indoctrination. This is what and that's maybe the key. They were being indoctrinated not only into learning these tools, but the tools being attached to the content as if there was no separation. And I felt my job was to pry those two things apart, to be aware that the tools have their use, and even in the tools to say, okay, this is a way to do things. I have a certain way of teaching storytelling and creation of content that I find works very well, but it's not the only way. By any means, I can't defend it on every film I see that I like and think is good, that actually fits my particular way of doing things. So the constant emphasis of reminding them that even the rules of filmmaking, think how much things transitioned from the 1980s, beginning of the 1980s in terms of film language to what we have now. This enormous revolution went on in terms of how cutting could happen and pacing, and everything changed dramatically. A lot of what music video was doing originally suddenly then gradually became the standard, almost too much in my personal taste. But nevertheless, the flexibility. So that to me, the idea was the student who came out knowing, I've got these tools, but they're not made of rock and stone. They're made of pliable tools. You can take a chance, break a rule, see what happens. And then in terms of content, if you want to be able to fit yourself into an industry job, you're going to have to learn, the skills become more refined. You have to be able to draw a character that they hand you and take it into different angles, and all these are very specific skills. But you should also be able to draw your own drawings, and you can also take these tools and use them. So it took, I found that they came in with generic thinking, and it was hardened in the first couple of years of school, as opposed to being I would have said from first year, start pushing them towards their own thinking as well. make it one thing, because then they absorb the whole thing as a rigid system, and then it's much harder. They're scared often in some cases to tell their own stories. They're scared to take a chance.
Yeah.
And another thing, a lot of what we aim for is we're trying to get a tight movement towards a successful, we're under pressure as teachers to produce successful students to go and get jobs. And what that leaves out is the room to make mistakes and to take chances and do things that might not work and yet might lead to something interesting happening that they wouldn't have gotten to otherwise.
Yeah. My opinion is kind of similar to what Rosa and then Alan kind of said. But another thing is, like my mentors who are in the industry like 70s and 80s, it's like, oh yeah, I never made my own film, and I draw well, I animate well, that's how I got hired for Disney, and that's kind of what I do. And I think that's wonderful. But like what you kind of say about how the film industry really kind of changed, and then there's a huge revolution. And even all the big companies now, they really kind of care for, it's not necessarily about the skill, like who are you, what can you actually kind of bring. A skill they can train, obviously you want to have a skill so that you bring the asset, but I think that they really kind of want to invest in the artists, like about their originality. Another thing is, in animation industry means like literally a billion different things. And for example, like at CSLB, we have option.
Yeah.
So for senior students, could make a film. Who really love to kind of like develop the original content, but some people really kind of love to play with the toy and play with the technical aspect. I don't think that there's anything wrong with it. So it's just kind of allowing students to be who they are, and then they really get to find their focus. And another thing is, when I'm kind of trying to teach certain like a practice, then students say, oh, teacher make me do it, okay, I will do it. Hopefully I get something out of it. But then when they really get to learn that with their own content, they get really excited. You really get to kind of see how their eye sparks. And then it's really kind of another big motivation. Okay, I'm having you do it, but like as a part of how you kind of bring yourself to be a part of the film. So I think I had the same question when I was a student 20 years ago. For example, one student wanted to have abstract film, and he really need to get a job. He doesn't have any money. So mine is like, well, if you really need the money, are you sure you want to spend 2 years, especially a grad student, 2 years making this abstract film? I love it, but I don't know, that really kind of helps. And then students, the one who are more determined about kind of wanting to do it, then actually the abstract film really kind of got him so many different opportunities. So I feel like it's kind of better to make a decision they believe in. Is it better to regret that kind of make a decision than always wonder what my life would have been?
What kind? Now this is really. Now, I think the fact that he could make an abstract film and actually be successful. We forget some. There are lots of oddball stories.
Exactly.
Tom was saying that two people go one kind of training ended up on the unexpected. What kind of opportunities came from the abstract film? Like, what did people see in him?
Well, I guess that student's case, I want a name, but I didn't have a permission. But he was like a stop motion, and not necessarily abstract, but there's a lot more like experimental way of a visual treatment.
Okay.
So I think a lot of music video, because like your kind of clients are the artists, they really kind of want to kind of go for that. Again, for me, kind of being in a more like a short subject. So I guess a commercial is a part of industry, but I'm not really part of a TV. I'm not part of the feature. I kind of got to work with the main studio from time to time, like a title sequence and things like that. But kind of in that unique situation, people want different style that is not part of the TV line, not part of the feature line. So a lot of students, especially in like experimental program and CalArts, for example, they kind of tend to go that route because it's still you're able to kind of direct and have your own direction while being a part of industry. So I think there's a lot of game happening these days and the VR. So I think industry evolve, and then with that revolution, with that evolution, we actually have so many different like open genre that is a part of the animation industry, which I think is really exciting transition.
Do you have a final project that expresses any of these sorts of elements in terms of?
Well, again, for me, in visual effects, I have.
Yeah,
it's totally different. But but there's a lot of parallels because like when a student comes in wants to do a portfolio project, they immediately everything they want to do is explosions. They want to do Transformers, and and you have to tell them. you know, there's a lot more in visual effects at Transformers and Star Wars. Why don't you explore different ways in which you can, and that is, I find it a lot harder for visual effects students than it is for animation students.
Okay, yeah.
Trying to convince them that explosions is not visual effects.
Right.
There's a whole
And
world
no
out there.
How much, no matter how much you
Yes.
wish it was. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's like, you know, there are beautiful visual effects that you wouldn't even know that they've used visual effects for, and you know, to those students, yeah, sometimes you have to really, it's like, come on, no explosions, no explosion, no explosions.
No fart jokes or no.
Yeah, and throughout my classes, I try to do that. Like, for example, the examples that I give them, I use very few explosions and very few distractions and very few. And so, yeah, I find myself just dealing with that a lot. So it's not the same, but I think that's the closest, you know, parallel that I find between, yeah.
Because I mean, there's the whole philosophy. I think because we've had a culture that's, you know, gets very, you know, has been very busy, and because people get tired, then it gets busier and busier, and also sort of formulates a vocabulary that gets narrower and narrower. And that I always want to say to students, like, let's take away all the easy things. Let's take all the things. Like, my students always wanted to do dictators who wanted to rule the world, but they were all the same dictators. So I used to tell them, say, find me 5 real dictators, either from fiction or real, and tell me, you know, what's the difference between Attila the Hun and Hitler, and you know, and they're all different. I mean, they're very, very distinctly different kinds of. They're being driven by personal story, actually.
Yeah.
So you're expressing someone's craziness in the and if the only place the generic one worked was, of course, Pinky and the Brain, which had awareness of that and made fun of exactly that. They just wanted to rule the world, and there was no particular reason why he wanted to do it, as far as I could tell, anyway. But that was, I mean, that was one of my. So I think we all have those things where they walk in with such a set thing in their mind.
Yeah, I remember I had a story with a student that I generally, I'm like what you were saying earlier, you try to encourage them to do what they want to do and to try to come up with, you know, analyze why, what's the goal, what's the purpose. But this particular student, we had to encourage him in the opposite direction because all his, what he wanted to do was really edgy, but in a bad way. There were a lot of, you know, violence in his films, and it felt a little strange.
Yeah.
So we tried to encourage him, can you please not, whomever watches your work, they're going to be turned off. Can you see that? Can we do something to fix that? I've only had to deal with that once, where you have to discourage a student from expressing themselves, and I'm pretty sure there were other issues in there. But yeah, that was, I thought, I don't know why you just thought about it.
Yeah. No, but it is, as the other one's always just fart films. I mean, the fart films would come, the farting pony, the Blue Angel films. It's just okay. They're hard things to sell. You'll now pass over to Lee to take over the rest of the Q&A. Okay.
Hi, everybody. I'm Lee Crow. I am an adjunct professor here at Woodbury. And I almost said Woodward Academy because that's the name of my high school. It's where my brain is right now. I also teach at Cal State Northridge. I teach mostly 2D animation or things connected to 2D animation. And that's my background as well. And I also work in the industry currently as a sheet timer, most recently for Warner Brothers and Nickelodeon. All right, so, and my background connected to international animation is I do have an accent, but it's from Georgia, so that's actually not another country.
Yes.
Kind of it.
Feels like it right now, but I attended Sheridan College, and I attended Sheridan College at the time when the regular program was, the brief explanation is the regular program was so popular that they started an international summer school of animation. So people from other countries would attend during that time period. So that was very interesting for someone from Georgia to go there and meet animation students whose average age was older, first of all, so that was interesting. But we had people from Sweden, we had people from Turkey, we had people from Japan who had traveled there just to take that program. And once again, it was nice to get the global perspective, the influence of the National Film Board and all the films that were coming in from other countries. So anyway, I'm just really going to moderate your questions.
About 15 minutes I left for
Yeah,
Q&A,
about
so-
15 minutes. So, does anybody have any questions for the panel?
One of the things we do in part of animation education is also help organize some of the scholarships, and we do a festival, and I'm also familiar as an ASIFA board member with the Annies, and one of the things that I've noticed is that many of the films that come from international schools have the students, there's a large group of students making a film, much like a sort of studio environment, even though the outcome of that film is often very experimental and not in an industry style at all. And then I attended UCLA, which is, one person, one film, 3 films in 3 years. Not that most of us ever got 3 films done, but so we were encouraged kind of to have a personal voice, and I have to say I made a thesis film that I did not use anywhere in my portfolio to apply to any place, because it would not have done me any good. Because I was doing sort of an experimental biography that was very kludged together out of a lot of different stuff. Ultimately, I kind of look at that difference, and I see schools here encouraging the singular voice versus at the same time trying to position their students for the industry. And then I see all this mirror opposite in a lot of the films I look at and a lot of the applications for scholarships from out of the country, where they are working collectively and completely exhibiting an individual voice, or a culturally individual voice. And so I'm wondering, from the experience of the people here, am I noticing a pattern that's just coincidental, or is there kind of a pattern here that actually exists?
I don't know. I can't really speak for anybody, but like what you said, I know that UCLA, one person, one film. Keller, I don't know. There's a motto, but it's kind of a culture that every single student are expected to kind of start and finish their own film. So in a USC, I believe it's similar. Again, I don't know. There's like a policy per se. So since it's not like my institution, I don't really want to kind of have a wrong statement. So having, especially in the LA culture, some of the school kind of having that like a system definitely kind of influence a lot of schools, I kind of believe. And also depends on like a Goblin, for example, is required to kind of pitch the idea as a group together. So a different school, different tradition, I think a different curriculum they're kind of like building in. I can kind of see like a plus and minus. One student came to me when we talk about bringing individual personal voice. So I grew up pretty happy and I don't have any voice. So what do you mean? It's like always they kind of have, okay, it's a bias or like a certain like a stereotype. And when we kind of talk about personal story, feel like I didn't get beat up by my parents or anything. Like who made you think that personal voice kind of means like a personal story? Maybe that's kind of maybe have something to do with it. It's like a more like a perspective. So when students kind of bring their own perspective, it doesn't really have to be one person's like a life story per se. I got kind of the different filmmaker kind of get together one day, really see as what they're excited about. And there are a group of students sometimes who are really excited about kind of developing a cool art direction. Some people really kind of love a certain storyline. I think encouraging that really kind of like make people to have a different. But how school has its own tradition, I don't think that's something that we can like mention other than it's just their tradition. Yeah. It may change. Yeah.
I just want to make a comment. Lee, can I borrow the mic? Lee, hello.
Oh, sorry.
Hello. Where was she? Where did she go?
Looking at the food that's not supposed to be in there.
Oh.
Sorry.
Whoops. Okay. Wasn't me. It was me. I just wanted to say that part of what happens is I think if something gets set in the bone of a culture at the beginning, it's very hard to overcome it. And I think part of what you do, because certainly when I was a student, you know, the awareness of there being a European tradition of art in general. I have friends who went, you know, who studied in France and some of the big, and they very much, they were in a room and they were supposed to play and experiment and try stuff, and then calls to the teacher occasionally. And I wonder if part of the North American idea, if you got to get on with things, we're kind of the go get do thing, so very focused, you know, like the engineer versus the architect kind of attitude, was already something that was beginning here and different and European, and as part, you know, you may dispute, but what happens certainly in the North American one is certainly, you know, other than probably a handful of schools in California and a very artsy couple of schools in places like Montreal teaching animation, Sheridan came in as literally a couple of guys from Hollywood being asked to come up to create a couple of courses in animation at Sheridan, and then selling the school, and they are creating a 2-year and eventually a 3-year program. But the George Marcellus, this one guy who was the guy who sold it, was himself he was making Christian educational films in animation. But he had a vision of recreating the golden age of animation, and that's what he wanted Sheridan to do. And so it came in on that model, and they were so set on that vision, and that means in the whole hog, both technique and you know, the professional expectations and the production line approach, and the content that went with it. And then of course Sheridan kind of mushroomed out and, you know, metastasized, however you want to put it, you know, around the world with a model that had become very successful. It was a training school into which you then sort of had to kind of push and shove and poke to put anything else in there. And I wonder if that's part of why that spread goes back to deep roots of education kind of expectations, and please prove me wrong.
Yeah, this is an opinion. I cannot.
That is yes, all opinions. Yeah. I hate to say it.
But I'm definitely I'm thinking that a lot of what you're seeing, it's what I've seen, it happens outside of the school environment. We don't have a lot of, or at least in Spain, we don't have a lot of schools or public schools, and that's the majority of schools that teach animation and visual effects and all that stuff. And you would have to go into little academies that give you, you know, certificates, not degrees, right? But what I see a lot of times is that if there is a hunger for you know, creating animation and doing this type of work, a lot of times will happen in the context of school, but it will happen as an individual, a few individuals getting together. You know, there's a clique in there of some sort, and they get together and they try to talk to the teachers, say, is there any way we can do this? And then the teachers facilitating that outside of school. I've seen that happening a lot. I don't know if that's the case with the work you've seen, but so it's not like in here where you know, we have a lot of animation schools, and obviously what you said, a lot of the animation schools kind of encourage, you know, that individualistic approach to things, but in there it's more like they are so hungry for things that in here we kind of, you know, are given. They're easy to, that when there is that little clique of 3 or 4 students that we want to do this together, it's you know, the school facilitating that, but almost outside of the curriculum, always you know, a lot of times outside of the academic part of things. I've seen that happening a few times. Again, I don't know if that's in particular what's happening with those films or not.
Just seen the pattern and seen the situation and looked at the difference between, to me, animation is an art, but it's also a craft, and that's where the skills live in that craft. And we kind of have to teach a mixture of them because, you know, a painter who can't figure out how to mix colors isn't going to be a very successful painter, and an animator who can't speak the language of animation and filmmaking and to have the skills and the crafts, whether it's digital or traditional, isn't going to make a very good film. So it doesn't really matter how good their voice is because it isn't going to be a successful project, you know, unless they right, or they managed to draft a bunch of really solid artist craft people behind them to make the film. And that's kind of what I'm seeing and wondering if I'm seeing in different, in the groups creating. But the competition at a festival or an award or a contest, a competition, whatever it's for, scholarship money or anything else, the difference in the quality and kind of film you can make with a skilled group of people who are craftspeople and artists and able to work in a competitive unit versus the sole person as a student, especially coming out of school as a student, the amount of quality you can muster completely on your own is makes for a pretty tough competition, and that makes me wonder if we need to be more open in the American schools to the collaborative efforts. And remember when we're talking about art that it's also a craft, and we don't maybe remember the name of the guy who did Picasso's prints, but he was a really craftsman's printmaker and a personal artist as well, so we don't necessarily remember, Lee and I both sat together in Little Mermaid drawing in-betweens and, so we don't remember those people, but the craft was part of the skill, and the skill feeds our personal teaching styles and does a lot of work for us. So to me, it was just that difference, and wondering, if there's a cultural difference if here we are in the United States where, it's the lone person making a success of themselves, climbing up from wherever they're climbing up from. Many cases from millionaires' houses, but it's that individual thing that's drummed into our culture, and wondering if there is a difference in other cultures that work that way.
Want to add. Collaboration, even if one student kind of come up with the idea, I think animation is always a collaboration. I felt like I always kind of tell students that collaboration always a constant compromise and complementing each other. So I think a lot of people learn so much from collaborating, but then I know that at some point that they kind of have to kind of give up what they kind of wanted to accomplish. I can't speak for all other schools because I don't really know their curriculum, but for example, like CSULB, we have a classes required to work as a group. So I think as students are kind of exploring like what would be advantage and disadvantage of kind of working together, and they kind of finish that as a group project. Then based on that lesson, so they kind of get to have their individual. So not necessarily, at least in Long Beach, I don't think we are kind of approaching as making solo film versus group is better, or the other way. It's just let's kind of have a two different experience, because there are times that you actually want to make your own film. There's really like specific about what you want to present. At the same time, like there's advantage that like you really get to pull all the talents and skills together, and it literally maximizes what we are able to do. So really kind of exposing like several different ways, and if students get to kind of learn about pros and cons and advantage and disadvantage of kind of pulling the different group, I think they have 60 more years to utilize that. That's the joke I make. Like, you guys have like 60, 70 more years. sorry for cutting down like your life. Like if you want to live like 120. But so so really kind of providing.
Do you ever have any pushback from students that don't want to collaborate or participate or being in group settings? Because I do have that a lot. Not a lot.
If it's like a group class, they're kind of assigning classes knowing it's a group class. Yeah. So I don't know they like or not, but they don't pass if they don't work as a group. So whatever like grunges they have, or fist fight, sucker punch, and have a beer overnight and like friends again. Whatever process they need to go through, I think that is part of learning.
I would say that in the original Sheridan model, which again, because it was a community college and not a university, meant that you could have every student take, you didn't have to go broad with that. You could go very narrow focus, which was advantage and disadvantage in certain ways. But that it did mean your class moved in lockstep through the courses. There were very few variations. They basically all took exactly the same curriculum. That in my and they went through many variations. Sometimes they assigned the class. Sometimes it was only group projects for third year. Sometimes it was only sometimes the films were too long or too short. They were always trying different models. But my real feeling would have been to have them start filmmaking earlier so they could have more chance to try things and fail and try and figure out what they were good at. But that to have somewhere in there both a group experience and the individual experience, partly because I really think I felt a lot of what my job was to do was to take my generic thinking about my students off and see who that person really was. Was this a person who might act, and sometimes they couldn't see themselves yet. One of the films we're showing later is someone who was not terribly sure of herself, and recently the work she's doing, what's shown up now is her ability to do non-human animation, to create effects, things abstract, has grown exponentially. And I had to point out, why are you doing anything else? Why don't you just do that? I think this will take you further. I don't know if it's money making or not, but as a filmmaker, as a whatever, this is clearly you've got an amazing skill here. And the other stuff you might be working on, but it's not at the same level. Why are you cluttering your work up with it? Every time you go the other direction, something isn't as exciting. But when you go this direction, it's just astonishing. That seeing, is this a person who maybe has that? I remember one student who ended up, I could see from the first day I met him that he was going to be a guy who could work on his own, be a small studio, because he could do everything already, even though he was only 20 years old. And sure enough, for the last 20 years, he said job after job. He does animation inserts and small things, and he did the illustrations for my book. And he's worked this way because that was him, right from the start. And that ability to try and help them focus themselves in the appropriate direction to the best use of their skills was kind of what I felt was part of what they're in school to learn to do, But balance.
All right. Any other
Oh,
questions?
did you want to say more to that, or no?
From the
maybe time for one more question.
I think he'd been raising
Yeah.
hands
Oh yes.
up back there.
Yeah.
Well,
So this is more of an adjacent to your responsibilities as educators. When you're teaching about historical figures, big, famous figures of art history, movie history, all that kind of fun stuff. Do you guys feel it's your responsibility to explain if they were mired in controversy, or is it still the consensus to separate the artist from the artist? Can you guys
that's
talk
an interesting big subject.
So, I don't know if you can hear that for the streaming. You got it? Okay.
Yeah.
You want me to repeat it?
if you can?
Okay. When teaching about historical figures in film or animation, do we speak to the controversy if they were a controversial figure? Does that pretty much sum it up?
Because when I was in school, I remember it was always strictly we separated it. But I'm wondering now if recent years, within the universities or individually, that policies, the mindset, the consensus may have changed.
I can start.
Oh, you have it. You're mic'd.
Double mic.
Double the fun.
Disney actually came to Long Beach a few months ago, and then I heard from my students.
Yeah.
And one of students asked for the Q&A section, what do you guys think about John Lasseter? And then they said, we want to focus on positive value. We really want to talk about how to make a good story. That was the answer. I thought that was a very wrong approach. Well, for me, anyway. What I always tell, at least my student, every teacher has a different way to kind of go about it, but I said that I'm not worrying too much about what kind of film they end up making. I really want them to be the artists who they want to be. So getting to talk about controversy, whether they get to be related in the future, similar cases, and how they need to speak up for themselves, how they need to embrace, how they need to take care of themselves as artists. I think that's a bigger aspect of learning film. So I always kind of talk about it in any part of a history, Fantasia, and Oscar Fischer go, oh yeah, he fought with Disney, and then he just wanted to kind of get away from it, didn't really like the point of view. Getting to kind of hear about what is happening behind, because we are not trying to make them learn about the technical skill of making. I really want them to learn about what will be involved when they actually go as a filmmaker, go in the industry. Some of the things we hear about the sexual harassment or any of abusive environment, that will be their word as soon as 1 month, 2 months later on. So I think that's really important part of exercise, more so than anything else.
I agree. Yeah. I don't see why you have to shy away from talking about those aspects. Try to be as non-judgmental, perhaps, but yeah, I don't see why. That's my personal opinion. Why?
This did come up in my class recently, and I kind of use my old high school journalism class knowledge, which is to use the word alleged a lot. Because we were recently studying John Crisfolucci, whose alleged crimes are pretty bad. The stories are pretty bad. So I don't want to gloss over it or ignore it. So I try to say, do your own research, form your own opinions about the person. And then I make a joke, like if we stopped watching the work of all of these people, we wouldn't have anything to watch, unfortunately. But the same does go for centuries back in art. There were famous artists who were controversial. So that's my approach usually, is just to say, yeah, this is what this person's been accused of, and here's their contribution to history. And let's not dwell on them too much, but let's also not ignore their contribution to history.
If there's a quick something, one last quick, or we should probably move on.
I know that the person picking up the pizza left late
Okay.
on purpose
Oh,
because
okay.
we started late. So
Okay.
I think we have
Let's
maybe
get a couple more minutes. Maybe one
Yeah.
more question then?
one or two more
Keep in mind, we
questions.
can always talk individually when we get there.
Yeah.
So.
Thank you. And then you.
So I want to go back on to what she was talking about too, about how there's the craft and like skills, the technical skills and all that, versus purely creative side, and those are two different like education, right? That you can teach, but I feel like so often that the focus is more leaning towards the creative side, and or like that is more like more significant almost. And but then there's clearly so many people that would love to do just like color correction or like in betweens, and they're really good at problem solving, so they would just do that for the entire life and they'll be really happy about it. So I'm just thinking, like, do you ever think about that, like about how there are students with different wants and needs of like how what they want to do in the industry once they get there? Because sometimes some of them might really want to be very creative and make their own thing, and there's some people that are just fine with it, like problem solving. So I always felt like there's always like professors that really hone in on technical skills, and they know what they're saying because they've done it and they've lived their life doing it. So they're like, this is how it looks good. And so I appreciate that opinion. And then there's professors that are like, you're free to do whatever you want, to explore and really like find yourself. And I'm like, okay. But but then if there's too much of either, if it's leaning on too much of either, I always get lost. I'm like, oh, where's me? Or when it's too technical, I'm like, oh, there is no me. Have you ever thought of that and how to like balance that?
I can go in. Well, one follow-up question though. Does it confuse you? Does it feel like you really kind of cannot find who you are as an artist when people kind of almost like force you to choose one way or the other?
Well, yeah, there's definitely like my own, just separate from school, like personal like exploration. I think about that, but I also feel like when it comes from the educators, like find yourself and encouraging me to find myself, then I think that's really helpful. Equally, I also feel helpful when they're really strict, really like, this is crap, why are you doing this? A red mark on it. Because they know what they're saying, because they've been there, and I really appreciate their opinion. But at the end of the day, I feel like every student should take that and be like, okay, I mean, his opinion isn't going to be the same as
Right.
art director over there and the art director over there.
Sorry, go ahead.
I liked actually to try and address that. 'Cause first place, the reality that out in the real world, they were also often going to get conflicting opinions. And I used to team teach with Kai Pindle, and I was the lead teacher. So I would often start a conversation and then start to say things that I knew would rile him up. So he would get up off his feet and we would start fighting basically in front of the class, but in an instructive way, because that is something to see that people can be on the ground of we're just trying to make this thing better, but coming at it from different points of view. And that as the worker, you have to kind of work your way around, how do you live with that? So that is one element, to not be conflicted about that, because it's going to happen all the time, especially in a studio situation, or even if you're moving from studio to studio, you're going to hit different expectations, and you have to find how you take, if you really can't adapt, maybe you have to go off and have your own place. If you can and can take from both things and find a balance or pick one side or the other, but it's a skill that you learn to deal with the reality that you can have a lot of different opinions among professionals of what's important. The other element I used to find was useful in that was that I would take advantage of the power I had as the final year teacher to sit them down and say, like, not only trying to see them as they really were and trying to help them see for themselves what their strengths were, but find out what they wanted to use this time for. So that if they wanted to be primarily, this is talking about 2D animation and drawn animation, but like actually on paper, but if they were really, say, showing a strong interest in layout, well, you can tell a whole story just in layout. There can be no animation whatsoever. And it's a really interesting exercise to show a house getting ready for a party before a hurricane hits, and then show the before and after, and not even show the hurricane, just imply the hurricane. And that you could get them through and make a film that actually let them spend basically that whole year perfecting the skill they wanted to show off the most. So there was an adaptability into a film project that doesn't have to be story in the ordinary sense, that let them balance those things so they could, if they wanted to really go deep on one craft, off they went. If they really wanted to show off animation skills, okay, let's take it down. Maybe take it one character or whatever it is. Take away, even put it in a void. It doesn't have to be backgrounds. We weren't marking, we didn't have a checklist. You have to this, and this. They'd been through those exercises. They now had to bring their education to a conclusion with something that most expressed who they were and what they wanted to be, which could combine a desire to show craft and or show off some kind of storytelling ability or content expression, and to find the way then to let them tailor it. It actually was quite successful, and it took off the boundaries of being one or the other and brought them together.
If I may add.
Sorry.
I should have asked Rosa one.
It's wonderfully professional, too. I think they just hand the mic across both ends.
Can we put you closer to each other?
Well, better planning.
Rosa, didn't you want to add anything?
Well, yeah, I was just going to say that I feel bad that you have to feel conflicted. You shouldn't have to feel conflicted. And if that's happening, then that means that we are failing as teachers, because that's definitely not what we want to, But and because you're absolutely right, there are people. I have a friend that he just does data cleaning for motion capture. He's been given the opportunity to animate. He doesn't want to be an animator. He's super happy doing that, which I would find horrifying, right? And vice versa. But you will find that obviously more often than not, we are not all John Lasseters. You're going to find that you're going to have to work for companies, and you're going to have to learn how to fulfill somebody else's vision. And if that creates some sort of frustration on your end, you're going to have to find an outlet for that. I have a lot of friends that work on their own projects outside of work, and they have a very rich, dual life in a way, right? They go to the studio, they do their stuff, they present. Obviously, you're always given the opportunity to make things a little bit your own. But in some cases, that is a bit more rigid, and if that, again, that's just too hard for you, then just outside of it, nobody's preventing you from creating your own art, right? And vice versa. So hopefully you won't feel conflicted.
Yeah, I think that's right.
It shouldn't be a conflict. I think you lift off. I think that's almost someone's emotional reaction imposed on the situation. The two things really are like this. The skill lets you say more. Having something to say, they're and in reality, everything can be shaped towards content, towards supporting content. So it is not it's really of a piece.
Mm-hmm. And then if you're independent artists, concept often get to be treated more importantly. But then like in any school, students actually get to create the content as well as they will kind of get a job. I think how I kind of describe is, like scientists say that we have a 1% or 3% of brain that we actually get to use in our lifetime. When I actually kind of get to work with the original content, feels like I kind of come from one side. And when I actually kind of have a more technical train, I kind of come from the other side. I do direct, I do work as an art director a lot. I love compositing. It's just something about like a turn off that like part of the brain and like just work with that like yeah, it's like a quality control. I'm not fixing every single pixel. Some people don't really like all aspects. I love a post-production because that's where I really get to like bring skills and make things shiny and better. So again, back to if you have a teacher, God bless them. Teachers that choose one way or the other, then obviously I think there's something wrong with the education. But then I think a lot of us really kind of, because we try to get to know individual students, but there's a certain limit. Trying to kind of provide how you can grow as artists, how you can really learn the skill, but ultimately you as its own unique artist really kind of see like when do I actually turn on and off. If it doesn't really kind of force you to feel like you're limited more than like I have an option when to use like a one way or the other. And I think a lot of times it actually kind of help each other, but you don't have to feel like everything has to be always a prison. Especially like when you're kind of doing color correction, I don't really want to kind of talk much about the timing. When I do the compositing, I don't want to really kind of talk too much about storyline. It's really about what you're focusing right at the moment.
Yeah.
And that really kind of bring up your expertise in that area as well. So
It can also be in terms of production that I found that often the way on the one hand I love improvisation. I love if you've got a strong technical skill set, you can jump in and just start playing with things because that skill set will guide you without you having to think of it consciously, and you can actually take a chance with something that you don't know where it's necessarily going to end. But in general, the way I tended to teach people who were just beginning, at the beginning I found it was the easiest thing was not even have a storyboard. Like even that box around the picture was a frame which was affecting their thinking and preventing them from understanding. I had them do very loose stuff, like very loose at the beginning. The ideas could go anywhere. It's like development is like a big plate of spaghetti. It's all over the place. It's here and there, whatever. And then at some point in the playing around with every time out, the spaghetti, the plate was changing configuration. Something would start to emerge, which was actually the real story spine, the real thing they wanted to say. And then we would start to go straight line. You start to structure things. Well, we know what the story is about. Now we know what might have to happen first and then second and third. And now we know why we're here and what point we're making. Therefore, we know where the frame is going to be. So it went from nice and loose and open that skill to this structuring, which was a narrower, a more craft-based skill of what does a frame do to content, for example, and then there's a whole conversation. So one thing led very naturally to the other, and I think it gave them room to have an experience of both ends without it feeling in conflict. It was just each in its proper order. Made sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, in a way, I feel like technical constraints encourage creativity in a way.
We need to finish.
Yes, yes, I know. Are you choking? Maybe she's choking.
Is it wrapping up?
Do you have time for, has the food actually arrived? Are we,
The pizza is here.
You want to say one last word each?
No.
Everybody happy?
Pizza, that's what I was saying.